Pandora's
Growing up,
box.
we get told a lot of legends, but one that's always stuck out to me has been the story of Pandora's box. There are numerous religious and spiritual texts which attempt to explain the origin of evil, the most famous of which can be found in the Bible, through the Garden of Eden. Stories such as these often attribute the fall of man to some sort of wicked being who tempted us into a new, sinful reality. However, the ancient Greeks presented a different interpretation of what really led man to forbidden territory. Pandora's box was a box or jar given to Pandora, the first woman on Earth. The box contained all the evils of the world, such as disease, poverty, and war, and was accompanied by a warning not to open it under any circumstances. However, Pandora's curiosity got the better of her, and she opened the box, unleashing all the evils into the world. The Greek telling of the original sin is rather unique, because it implies that mankind is responsible for its own downfall, a notion that has only grown more salient over time. Concerns of man-made doom now pervade our lives more than ever, and are beginning to appear where we least expect them. The preceding paragraph of voiceover was written by ChatGPT, an AI writing tool which many suspect will lead to a cascade of unforeseen consequences. It seems like we are opening a new version of Pandora's box every day, and while many may experience this as a distinctly modern dilemma, it turns out that we've been opening the box for a lot longer than we think. I suppose you could say that humanity's wayward path began when we departed from the animal kingdom. While we once existed alongside animals as products of nature, we have since assumed the role of quasi-caretakers, although for centuries, it's hard to say that any care was being taken. In fact, the natural world had not yet seen a force as ruthless and destructive as man.
The creation of the world.
When we put our minds to it, we have the unprecedented ability.
The creation of the world is Pandora's box, right?
No.
Because if you make a world,
No. It's not true, because you need to be able to reason to be able to tell good from bad. So animals aren't good or bad, they just are, right? They just are. So before, we just were, and the reality and the universe and all that just was. It was there. It wasn't good or bad. But since we can think and we have morality, now every step of the way, when we get new things, we also get new things to fuck it up again, right?
world with the box and evil's in the box. Well, the box is everything. So does that make that stupid of a thing? If you think about it,
yeah, the point of the story is that the fact that Pandora was the first woman is important, because it implies that the first woman, right, did that. So the second will also do that, and the third will also do that, so that we are still doing that every time. Every time a new person is born, they will do that thing, right? Because it's in human nature to be curious over being good. You get it? Do you get it? Do you get it? Do you get it? Do you get it?
Right? If you create everything and you make also a box that has everything that's bad in it, well, you don't even have to open it. You still made the bad. So you still open the box.
To single-handedly make other creatures disappear. Since the advent of human civilization after the end of the last ice age, animals have been going extinct at a rate not seen since the last of the dinosaurs. While many may attribute this process to our efficient hunting practices, the main culprit lies in the development of agriculture and the widespread destruction of natural habitats for land clearing. These damaging practices have resulted in effects which sound almost unfathomable. At the turn of the 19th century, billions of passenger pigeons blanketed the skies of North America. Just 114 years later, they had ceased to exist entirely. The long-term consequences of modern extinction events can be difficult to define on a global scale. It is primarily through localized ecosystems which we can truly understand the importance of individual species, a lesson that was taught to us after the removal of the Yellowstone wolves. One of the most disastrous ecological follies we ever oversaw came about, ironically, from one of our first attempts at conservation. In 1872, the US government established the first national park in Yellowstone, Wyoming. The preserve was intended to provide federal protection of the area's natural resources, but at a time when our understanding of ecology was still in its infancy, not all nature was treated equally. Yellowstone happened to be home to an abundant population of gray wolves. Due to the threat they posed to humans and livestock, early park managers were quick to label the predators as undesirable. It wasn't long before the Yellowstone wolves were in the crosshairs of a full-scale eradication campaign. About 50 years after the park's foundation, the entire wolf population had been functionally erased. Soon after, what was seen as a solution quickly devolved into an even greater problem. It turns out the wolves were instrumental at keeping the local elk population in check. With their key predators now absent, the number of elk skyrocketed, resulting in overgrazing of the park's flora. Acres of forest were no longer allowed to grow as budding saplings were prematurely eaten. The waning vegetation could no longer anchor the terrain, which began to erode away. Local beavers couldn't find enough wood to build their dams, altering the constitution of the park's rivers and streams. In their time, the Yellowstone wolves only represented several hundred organisms. It must have been easy to dismiss their presence as inconsequential. What we failed to realize is the role they played in a finely tuned equilibrium that persisted for millennia. Disrupting even a single component was enough to throw the entire ecosystem out of balance. By the 1990s, the park had fallen into such disarray that a new population of wolves had to be reintroduced in an attempt to reverse the damages. The fiasco would serve as a hard lesson that the natural world is often far more complex than we think. As others would soon discover, adding animals to an ecosystem can be just as destructive as removing them. In the 1930s, Australian sugar farmers were looking to control the native cane beetle. Their solution was to introduce the invasive cane toad from the jungles of South America. Starting with just over 100 individuals, the Australian cane toad population would eventually balloon to over 200 million. They now inhabit nearly a quarter of the continent and are actively disrupting other native wildlife on both sides of the food chain.
There's fucking Australia. They have the same thing with the cats, man. With the cats. And they keep them because all the cats, of course they do.
The toads will likely persist as a constant nuisance into the foreseeable future. The worst part is, they never had any effect on the beetles they were brought in to stop. While invasive animals may contribute their fair share of carnage to local ecosystems, invasive plants have the potential to be even more destructive. Such is the case with the notorious kudzu vine, which now blankets entire landscapes in the American Southeast. Originally introduced in the 1870s as an ornamental, the plant would expand aggressively, rapidly climbing up and over acres of native woodlands. The vine is so oppressive that it effectively blocks out the sun for all other competing plants, slowly smothering and killing everything in its path. Fans of biodiversity should be relieved that kudzu is still mostly limited to the eastern half of the country. As for the Wild West, they happen to have their own kind of invasive vegetation, one that is already familiar to many of us. The tumbleweed has long persisted as an iconic symbol of the Western aesthetic. What many fail to realize, however, is that this peculiar plant is not supposed to be here. Originating in 1870 from a shipment of Russian flax seeds, the tumbleweed has run roughshod ever since. Depending on the terrain, they can travel through hundreds of miles of unimpeded wilderness, spreading their seeds along the way. This creates a mobile threat that is practically impossible to isolate and remove. Tumbleweeds are very much here to stay, and while they contribute to some rather comedic frustration, their consequences become much more grim when combined with another common fixture of the West: In the event that the arid landscape is set ablaze, these unsuspecting plants are suddenly transformed into flaming projectiles, capable of torching the surrounding area in record time. It's safe to say that the tumbleweed was probably never meant to exist in America. It's hard to believe that less than 200 years ago, they weren't even here at all. The same could be said about Providence Canyon, which is often thought of as a miniature Grand Canyon, but rather than being forged by nature, this colorful landform can trace its origins back to man-made error. Starting in the 19th century, a combination of extensive land clearing and poor drainage led to tremendous erosion in an otherwise normal plot of farmland in the Georgia countryside. By the 1900s, the subsidence had spawned a gash in the landscape over 100 feet deep and a mile across. Today, the canyon exists as an amusing tourist attraction, but its history serves as a reminder of how even our most simple mistakes have the power to scar the earth itself. While we have been fortunate to come out of most environmental blunders somewhat unscathed, we can only ask Mother Nature to take one for the team so often. Tragically, there is one ecological decision which has likely contributed to more human suffering than any other. In 1958, Mao Zedong instituted the Four Pests campaign, which sought to eradicate unwanted vermin from communist China. Among the vermin targeted was
30
the sparrow,
million, 40
blamed
million
for
people.
disrupting the country's supply of grain. Over the next 2 years, the Chinese drove the local sparrow population to near extinction, going so far as to bang drums for days until the startled birds dropped dead from exhaustion.
What?
After the near total removal of the species, Mao's plan immediately began to backfire. It turns out that in addition to grain, the sparrows consumed a substantial amount of insects, particularly locusts. With a major predator out of the picture, the locust population exploded, resulting in widespread crop failures and food shortages. After recognizing the severity of the mistake, government officials scrambled to replenish the population, but the damage was already done.
Locust swarm.
The decision to exterminate the sparrow was one of several contributing factors of the Great Chinese Famine, a disaster which led to the deaths of up to 55 million people. It turns out the leaders of China had a history
Dude, that's
of
the
tempting
deadliest
fate.
event ever.
Emperor
I'm
Qin
pretty
Shi
sure.
Huang was notable for unifying China more than 2,000
This guy is
years
the
ago.
deadliest guy ever.
Wanting his reign to last forever, Qin sought out the secret to immortality. After searching far and wide for the solution, he believed to have found it through an exotic mineral known as cinnabar. The emperor spent years drinking the compound by mixing it with his wine, but rather than granting eternal
Classic
life,
Chinese
it accomplished
emperors,
quite
man.
the opposite. Emperor Qin died prematurely at the age of 49, most likely from consuming a lethal amount of the element we now know as mercury.
Out of all rocks you could think about, this motherfucker found the one rock with mercury inside.
It took us a long time to reach a basic understanding of the chemical world, an odyssey which led to plenty of mistakes along the way. We unknowingly interacted with substances like mercury for centuries before discovering their toxic properties. Mercury in particular causes
Body
severe
can't get rid of
damage to
it.
the kidneys, lungs, and brain, with even short-term exposure capable of inducing insanity. An equally sinister element can be found just one space over on the periodic table: lead. Its chemical symbol is Pb, short for the Latin word plumbum, a name that carries with it a rather disturbing implication. Plumbum happens to be the root word of plumbing, which is sadly no coincidence. Due to the soft and malleable properties of lead, it was commonly manufactured in pipes that delivered drinking water to the Roman people. When ingested, nearly all lead is trapped within the human body, where it remains indefinitely. Compared to mercury, lead is far less potent. Its detrimental effects on health take much longer to materialize. Historically, this has allowed the metal to appear deceptively safe, resulting in far greater exposure to the general population. Now classified as a neurotoxin, lead contamination eventually causes the deterioration and impairment of cognitive abilities. Some historians now attribute lead to the sudden collapse of the Roman Empire, hypothesizing that the leaching of toxins into the population gradually drove them mad. The frequent industrial use of lead continued all the way into the 20th century, but didn't reach epidemic proportions until the release of leaded gasoline. The process of burning tetraethyl lead in combustion engines turned the metal into an airborne contaminant through car exhaust. The chemical became inescapable, effectively poisoning the entire US population. By 1976, the lead content measured in American blood had risen to more than 4 times the natural level. The oil and automobile industries lobbied to keep lead in gasoline for as long as they could, but eventually, its toxicity was indisputable, and world governments began phasing it out of production. As leaded fuel was gradually outlawed, what followed was a remarkable trend which illustrated its disturbing effect on the population. The removal of lead emissions from the environment almost directly correlated with a decrease in violent crime. Tetraethyllead was initially developed by chemical engineer Thomas Midgley Jr., regarded by many as the single most destructive inventor in human history. Shockingly, leaded gasoline may not have been the most disastrous part of his legacy. Midgley was also the father of chlorofluorocarbons, the compound eventually responsible for burning a hole in the ozone layer. Most people now know this seasonal void over Antarctica as the extent of the damage, but the true influence of CFCs extends much further. Since its widespread release into the atmosphere, the chemical has depleted about 4% of the ozone for the entire planet. As the atmospheric layer which shields the surface from harmful ultraviolet radiation, its weakening is forecasted to cause an uptick in skin cancer and cataracts for the foreseeable future. And although CFCs have been mostly phased out, the ozone supply is not expected to fully recover until at least 50 years from now.
Oh, that's not too bad.
The 20th century was truly the point of no return for unleashing a plague of chemicals onto the unsuspecting world. For decades, highly cancerous PCBs would be recklessly dumped into local water supplies. A rather egregious offender of such was the Monsanto Chemical Company, which knowingly poisoned the people of Anniston, Alabama. To this day, the town still has among the highest rates of cancer and birth defects in the nation. PCBs represented a rather unholy achievement in chemical engineering. They were one of the first man-made compounds capable of rendering entire places inhospitable. Even so, they didn't compare to the sheer scope and pervasiveness of another industrial byproduct of the same era, asbestos. What originated as a naturally occurring mineral quickly began to be used in highly artificial ways. Its strong insulative properties made the substance an ideal candidate for construction. By the 1970s, asbestos had become ubiquitous in homes, schools, and hospitals around the world.
Put it everywhere.
It traded numerous consumer goods, including appliances, cigarettes, makeup, and even baby powder. Eventually, all who came into contact with the supposed wonder material would soon regret it. When disturbed, asbestos releases long microscopic fibers which become permanently embedded in lung tissue when inhaled. The substance went on to infect generations of people with deadly respiratory illness. Asbestos exposure is attributed to more than 100,000 deaths annually. Its lingering presence in pre-existing infrastructure continues to put people at risk, long after most places have banned the stuff entirely. The most hazardous forms of asbestos have even led to the abandonment of entire towns, as was the case with Wittenoom, Australia, which is set to be totally demolished as of this year.
Why demolish it? Why not just bomb it?
The true title for most hazardous man-made development has to go to another breakthrough of the 20th century, when humanity crossed over into the nuclear age. If there was ever something that man was never meant to discover, this was probably it. For it was through splitting the atom which we inherited unspeakable powers of destruction. Even in its simplest form, the atomic bomb had already cemented its status as the ultimate weapon. As if it wasn't enough to convert an entire city to ash in a matter of seconds, whatever remained would be irradiated from nuclear fallout, inflicting even more torment on any survivors unlucky enough to wander the hell we left behind. It took just 2 of these weapons to coerce immediate, unconditional surrender from the most zealously unbreakable military on the planet. It was as though we had somehow transcended the abilities of mere mortals, suddenly gaining access to the wrath of gods. To put it more concisely, we had become death, destroyer of worlds.
Hold on.
This phrase was infamously spoken by the father of the atomic bomb, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the subject of a highly anticipated biopic releasing this summer. The quotation refers to what ran through his mind at the moment of the Trinity detonation, mankind's very first glimpse into our nuclear future. Oppenheimer's rather ambiguous relationship with his creation has since been met with irreverence by some, often to comedic effect. It's hard to imagine that the architect of a superweapon would feel any sort of sympathy for its victims, but I'd like to believe that when Oppenheimer said this, he wasn't just thinking about Japanese civilians. While gazing into the brilliant fireball that was supposed to signal the end of the war, it's possible that he instead saw the end of everything. With nuclear weapons, humanity had indeed inherited the keys to the kingdom. We had unlocked the sobering ability to destroy ourselves. By the time of Oppenheimer's death in 1967, the world powers had manufactured enough firepower to wipe out most of the population, a stockpile with the potential to transform any ordinary day into Armageddon. Considering our reckless track record with far lower stakes, you have to wonder whether such a responsibility would be too much to handle. Thus far, we have yet to wake up to the nuclear apocalypse, but there have been plenty of very close calls. Every few decades, another reactor meltdown reminds us of just what kind of power we're dealing with. The most catastrophic accidents have rendered certain areas uninhabitable for thousands of years, and this was all while we were trying not to hurt anyone. The Chernobyl exclusion zone, home of the worst nuclear meltdown in history, is estimated to remain irradiated until the year 22,000. By then, the area should finally be safe for people to return, although at this rate, it's hard to say whether we'll even be around to see it. As of today, nuclear warfare persists as an unmistakable threat to human existence, but it's far from the only doomsday scenario of the modern age. While much of our paranoia remains focused on the outside world, our true demise could just as easily come from the inside. Although an enormous radioactive mushroom cloud is quite effective at killing people, the same result could be achieved with just a small dose of poison. As opposed to ordinary chemicals, poisons act far more potently by specifically targeting critical body systems. Pound for pound, they are among the most efficiently lethal substances known to man. Perhaps we have come to know them a little too well. For thousands of years, the Japanese have enjoyed a delicacy called fugu, otherwise known as pufferfish. Preparing the dish is considered extremely difficult due to the high amount of tetrodotoxin within most of the fish's body. Improper preparation can easily prove fatal, as even a small amount of the toxin is enough to cause death by asphyxiation. Despite the variety of far safer food available, some people just really like rolling the dice. Tetrodotoxin is only about half as toxic as the deadliest man-made poison ever synthesized, a compound by the name of VX. Originally marketed as a pesticide, its toxicity was so severe that militaries around the world began adopting it for use as a chemical weapon.
Muscle gas?
Eventually, the substance was understood to be so dangerous that not even world governments felt safe producing it. As of 2015, more than 98% of the global supply of VX had been destroyed, a greater reduction than the supply of nuclear weapons. It makes you wonder if we found the toxin to be even more frightening. While human beings have proven to be incredibly skilled at destruction, the world of poison remains one place where nature still has its beat. The venom of the box jellyfish and several species of poison dart frogs has been measured as magnitudes more deadly than anything we've created. The single most poisonous substance ever discovered is produced not by an animal, but bacteria. Botulinum toxin is the most potent neural agent known to man. A dose of just 75 nanograms is enough to kill the average adult. It is the key contributor of botulism, a condition which, left untreated, results in total paralysis of the body. Given all that, you'd think we'd try to avoid it. But remarkably, the opposite is true. Botulinum toxin is actually one of the most heavily demanded poisons in the world, due to a cosmetic procedure better known as Botox. As was the case with Emperor Qin, we are still searching for eternal youth by ingesting poison. Bacterial toxins are far from the only microscopic threats that now await us in the modern world. Urbanization and the advancement of global transportation systems has contributed to the unprecedented spread of infectious disease. As many are now exhaustively aware, it no longer takes much to start a worldwide pandemic. The next civilization-altering virus is potentially just a 24-hour plane ride away. Fortunately, the most contagious viruses tend to be the least deadly. When it was all said and done, the coronavirus outbreak resulted in just a 1% fatality rate. For comparison, the 1918 Spanish flu was estimated to have killed up to 10% of the infected. Anything more lethal and you start to enter the murderer's row of pathology. What they lack in contagiousness is more than made up for with pure stopping power. Anthrax, Ebola, and the now eradicated smallpox all have a maximum untreated mortality rate of around 90%. Rabies has a mortality rate of nearly 100% after its symptoms manifest, with only a few cases of survival ever recorded in history. At one point in time, all of these diseases would have been a virtual death sentence, but medical science has since come a long way. Currently, every disease that
I need to get my rabies shot, I forgot, and my tetanus shot.
Chance of survival. Every disease except one. In the 1950s, anthropologists discovered an unusual illness affecting the Foray people of Papua New Guinea. Known by the locals as kuru, the disease would induce rapid physical and mental deterioration. For years, its origin was a mystery, until scientists started connecting it to the Foray practice of cannibalism. In most cultures, the idea of eating human flesh is an extreme taboo, and as we would soon discover, there's a strong biological reason for that. Kuru is part of a broader classification of disease called transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. The condition stems from misshapen protein molecules known as prions, which bind to and corrupt healthy tissue. Once even a single prion is introduced to the body, it can remain dormant for decades before unleashing an unstoppable cascade of internal damage. Prion disorders are undetectable, incurable, and unsurvivable. They are transmitted by ingesting the contaminated flesh of the diseased, which is most often brain matter. So if you want to avoid infection, just stay away from cannibals. Seems simple enough. But what if that cannibal wasn't human? In the 20th century, to cope with skyrocketing meat consumption, cattle farmers sought out cost-effective ways to feed their ever-expanding herds. Eventually, someone came up with the bright idea of mixing the processed remains of dead cows back into the feed, essentially turning the living cows into cannibals. And with cannibalism came a bovine version of kuru, which is better known as mad cow disease. Prions from the tainted beef would work their way up the food chain and into the mouths of unsuspecting people. Some have called the mad cow outbreak the first truly man-made epidemic. However, it was far from the first plague to come out of animal agriculture. In fact, many of the most destructive diseases in history were transmitted to us from livestock. This circumstance is believed to be the primary reason why European colonization had such a devastating effect on the Native Americans. The colonists had lived in close proximity to domesticated animals for generations and had grown resistant to their diseases. The Native Americans, meanwhile, did not, and couldn't stand a chance against the onslaught of ailments from the Old World. Animal-borne diseases have ended civilizations before, but could they do so again? Especially versus our modern medical advancements. Well, it turns out that one advancement may soon force us to take a great step backwards. The meat industry is an aggressive user of antibiotics, once considered to be a permanent solution to bacterial infections. In recent times, however, the microbial world has been striking back. The overuse of antibiotics has counterintuitively made certain strains of bacteria stronger. The more we apply the medication, the more likely it is for surviving microbes to develop immunity. As antibiotics continue to be overprescribed to both humans and animals, they run the risk of losing their effectiveness entirely. Experts have long feared the emergence of a superbug which is impervious to any known treatment. Such an outbreak would essentially set us back to pre-industrial times, where even a small bacterial infection could prove fatal. This should be especially concerning, considering the worst pandemic in history, the bubonic plague, was bacterial.
If everybody dies from it, and whatever, isn't that good? Does that mean that the thing will die? Does that have a hope?
Poland. How the fuck
If
do you
a
avoid
similar
this shit?
strain were to arise, we could be powerless to stop it. Such a scenario is
How do you avoid that, man?
Antibiotic-resistant bacteria is already responsible for 700,000 deaths per year, a figure that could rise to 10 million by 2050. There's a misconception that we have left most of our problems in the past, and that we have somehow grown more capable of solving them in the present. It's easy to blame the mistakes of older generations on their ignorance, but it would be naive to suggest that our circumstance today is any different. The truth is that we're still not quite sure how anything we're doing today will affect the future. All of the biggest man-made problems in history only got that way because they weren't obvious when we introduced them. In 1986, an event like Cleveland Balloon Fest was seen as harmless and whimsical fun, while many look back on it today with disturbing unease. Modern concerns of microplastics in the environment have made us reconsider the last 70 years of previously innocuous activities. As of now, the jury's still out on whether plastic pollution is harmful to human health, but for our sake, we had better hope it's not. Microplastics have infiltrated every layer of the food chain, down to the air, water, and soil. One study suggests that the average person now ingests 5 grams of plastic per week, equivalent to the mass of a credit card. By 2050, the amount of plastic in the ocean is expected to outweigh the amount of fish. Ready or not, plastic debris is now a part of our world, and all we can do is cross our fingers that it has no effect on anything. They said the same thing about asbestos and lead, but surely this time will be the exception. We are still very much in the age of unforeseen consequences.
Yummy
These
plastic.
days it feels like the price of progress
just
keeps getting steeper. Whether it's the chemicals we keep putting into the environment or our own bodies, it's difficult to not feel at least a little anxious for the future.
It's plastic.
You have to wonder if we'll ever reach a point where we start creating problems faster than we can fix them. Maybe we're already there. An often neglected part of the legend of Pandora's box is what remained in the box after all the evils were released. The most open-ended part of the story fixates on our interpretation of the Greek word elpis, most commonly translated as hope. Scholars disagree on whether the inclusion of hope in the box should be considered a blessing or a curse. On one hand, it can be seen as the ultimate tool to protect ourselves from the rest of the...
They said it best in, I don't remember what movie. I think it's Hunger Games. They said, a little bit of hope, good. Too much hope, dangerous.
The evils, the lone antidote designed to counteract the wickedness that once imprisoned it. However, a far more pessimistic outlook of the situation sees hope as yet another evil, leading us astray on a path towards salvation that's never coming. It may be convenient to believe that sometime down the line, people way smarter than us will just figure it all out. And
dude, my interpretation, right? To see the hope, you have to have looked in the box. So to have hope, you need to first have evil, right? Then it's not really, that's pretty neutral.
Solve everything. Perhaps artificial intelligence will come to the rescue, or just add to the problem. Maybe if the Earth gets too polluted, we can just evacuate to another world. Hopefully we can do so before the South...
With the plastic thing, we have hope. That is not really dangerous. Because we already have the plastic. We already opened the box, so now there's hope in the box.
Satellites in orbit disintegrate into a deadly debris field
now we
that
just need
traps
to look
us here
again
with all our mistakes
to have the hope.
In many ways, that would probably be the most fitting end to our story. There's a cosmological principle known as the Great Filter, which attempts to explain the absence of other intelligent life in the universe. The hypothesis warns of some inevitable barrier which prevents civilizations from expanding beyond a certain level of complexity. It's possible that advanced species reach a point where they become too powerful for their own good, where the enormity of their problems far surpasses the capacity of their intellect to solve them. Are we on our way to getting filtered? As unpleasant of a thought it may be, the arrow of progress only points in one direction.
Combustion, water power, stone tools. What would have been the most fun to discover, chat? Iron tools. Imagine you pull up to some fucking caveman.
Probably
like
water tools. You get to be lazy.
Battle. But you've
before you had to work.
You and the Soul Squad. You've been in
probably
the lab.
The domestication of the animals
now,
is the most fun.
You got a bunch of swords
before you had to work.
In this bitch.
Now you can just
pull up to the
lay
battle.
back.
These guys come up with their beards and whatnot. They got hammers, and they go shh, and they just get fucking absolutely busted.
If there is an unspeakable catastrophe waiting for us at the end of the line, it's hard to imagine we'd stop ourselves before we get there. Perhaps that's the lesson of Pandora's box. Once it's open, there's no shutting it. The changes we make to this world are permanent and irreversible. Despite all of our progress, we are still very much at the mercy of nature, which exists to remind us that everything we have been given can just...
Bombs. Nitrate, bombs, TNT. And then the whole squad, I was like, guys, we got the guns.
Okay, that's
guys,
pretty fun.
We got the snipers, the whatever, guys. We cannot
Right.
be losing this battle, guys.
Gunpowder, that's pretty fun.
Pew! One bullet. All of a sudden, some enemy chucks some fucking big ass fucking
Imagine
load,
being the
satchel.
first guy
Wink,
to
whole
put
squad
the
in
cannon
tent.
at the wall and blast that
Everybody
shit.
fucking blows the fuck up,
That's
dude.
pretty fun.
Boom!
just as easily be
Come
taken
on now.
away. If we are
That's pretty
here
fun.
Now we're
towards
talking.
the end, may we stand in awe of its totality and finality. Only then will we truly comprehend our inescapable reality as mortal creatures. When contemplating the fragility of existence, I am often reminded of a passage I read from a modern-day philosopher. They present the image of a mouse whose curiosity has led to its demise, on which they comment the following. One day, while doing nothing particularly out of the ordinary, because of natural laws he was completely powerless to understand or intuit, he was instantly killed in a horrifying way by forces vastly in excess of anything he was ever designed to experience, for no reason, to no one's particular surprise or upset. In this, we are more like him than different.
I enjoyed.
This is Wittenum.
You know what? Nope, I disagree with my argument I said earlier. You know what I think, chap? You know what I think? It doesn't matter, right? It's never like a plateau when you discover something new. It's always gonna be at least kind of like this. It's never gonna be like this. Like, oh, we got tools, okay. This guy got a gun, okay. You wanna know why? I just thought about it. Because of perfection. The first bronze tools were probably sucky. The first guns were probably shit. The advantage you had out of having one of those guns was probably pretty dog shit. They were probably complete trash and just didn't work. And by the time they were good, the other guys had better guns. And it was probably like a tight race, and the advantage was probably very minimal, let's be honest.
I just like what's happening
It
now
was
with
probably very
computers.
minimal, I think about it. No way, because some guy pulled up.
The
like,
computers back in
oh,
the day
we got the
were
first gun,
really-
M16.
compared to now, they just
Everybody
stop
starts
shit.
fucking dying. It was probably some fucking
having
bullshit
them
powder
then
gun, like Blunderbuster.
Night and day.
Bonk!
The difference
Like, blew up
overall
and
that it
shit.
made
And
was
the back-
insane. But the difference individually between one thing and another is also very big, but the difference across the board isn't that big. It's not, or it's not like in 2000 society was so much different than now. But the technology is very much way better now. However, if you go back further, if you take a different look, go from World War One. Wait, what the fuck am I talking about? Go from World War Two, slightly after, to World War One, slightly after, and the difference is very big. Very big. What the fuck am I talking about? This makes no sense.